Hello and welcome to Calm Chronicles. I'm glad you're here. Before we step into the past, take a moment to subscribe and like this video. It helps these echoes of history reach more curious minds. Why Rome still matters. Throughout human history, few civilizations have left an imprint as deep and enduring as ancient Rome. At its height, Rome's territory stretched from the windswept coasts of Britain to the sands of Egypt, from the Atlantic shores of Hispania to the valleys of the Middle East. It was an empire of extraordinary contrasts, brutal conquest and astonishing creativity, rigid hierarchy and revolutionary ideas. But why, after so many centuries, does Rome still capture our imagination? Why do scholars, artists, and everyday people return to its ruins, study its literature, and marvel at its engineering? The answer lies not only in Rome's achievements, but in the very human story of how they rose and how they fell. Rome began as a cluster of humble huts along the Tiber River, born from legend and necessity. It grew, over centuries, into a superpower that defined the classical world. For generations of Romans, empire was not simply territory, but an identity, a belief in their mission to bring order, law, and civilization to every corner of the known world. They called it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. And yet, behind this vision of grandeur lay the same vulnerabilities we see in every society. Ambition that slid into corruption, wealth that bred inequality, power that sparked civil war. Rome's story is a mirror. When we look into it, we glimpse our own aspirations and our own mistakes. Consider the roads they built, over 250,000 miles of carefully laid stone. They were not only pathways for trade and conquest, but also symbols of connection. Even today, many European highways follow the same routes first surveyed by Roman engineers more than 2,000 years ago. In cities from London to Tunis, you can still find their walls, their amphitheaters, their aqueducts, silent witnesses to a vanished world. Their laws, too, endure. The principles of Roman law shaped the foundations of modern legal systems across Europe and the Americas. The idea that citizens had rights and that no one, not even the powerful, was above the law was radical for its time. So was the belief in civic duty, that every citizen had a role to play in the life of the state. Then there is the Roman imagination. In their literature, we hear voices that still feel close: the wit of Cicero, the melancholy of Ovid, the grandeur of Virgil. In their art and architecture, we see a civilization that believed in beauty as a form of power. The Pantheon still stands, its vast concrete dome unchallenged by time, reminding us that true ambition can leave monuments that endure millennia. This is why Rome still matters. It is the story of how a small city transformed the world and how it lost what it had built. It is the story of the best and worst in us, of vision and pride, of ingenuity and arrogance. It reminds us that no achievement, however great, is permanent. As you listen to this journey through time, I invite you to reflect on your own world, on what we build and what we neglect, on the legacies we leave behind. Take a moment to let the noise of the present fade. Allow yourself to step into the past. The Roman Empire awaits. Every civilization begins with a story. For Rome, that story is a legend wrapped in symbolism, a tale passed from generation to generation, half myth, half memory. According to tradition, the origins of Rome trace back to the twins Romulus and Remus, born of noble and divine blood. Their mother, Rhea Silvia, was a Vestal virgin, sworn never to bear children. But the god Mars, the embodiment of war, desired her, and from their union the twins were conceived. This detail alone is telling. Rome, even in legend, was destined to be a child of conflict and ambition. When the king of Alba Longa, fearful of their potential, ordered the infants drowned in the Tiber River, fate intervened. The river flooded, carrying the basket to safety and gently depositing it near the Palatine Hill. There, in a quiet cave called the Lupercal, a she-wolf found the crying babies. She nursed them as her own, an image so powerful it would become Rome's enduring symbol: strength, wildness, and survival against impossible odds. Raised later by a shepherd and his wife, Romulus and Remus grew into bold young men, natural leaders among their peers. In time they learned the truth of their birth and overthrew their grandfather's usurper. Returning to the banks of the Tiber, they decided to build a new settlement, the beginning of a city that would shape the world. But even in legend, Rome's birth was marked by violence. The brothers quarreled over where the city should stand. Romulus favored the Palatine Hill, Remus the Aventine. When Remus mocked the low walls Romulus had begun, stepping across them in defiance, Romulus struck him down. Some versions say it was an accident. Others say it was deliberate, a warning that no one would challenge Rome's destiny. With Remus dead, Romulus became the city's first king, giving it his name. Beyond myth, archaeology offers a different but no less fascinating story. The hills around the Tiber were settled by humble communities as early as the 10th century BC. Farmers and shepherds built simple huts of wood and thatch, living close to the land. The Palatine, the Aventine, and the Capitoline hills provided natural defense and commanding views of the river valley. What set this region apart was geography. The Tiber River was both a barrier and a highway, connecting inland tribes to the Mediterranean. Fertile plains stretched beyond the hills, ideal for crops and livestock. Trade routes crisscrossed the region, carrying goods from Etruria in the north and Magna Graecia in the south. These conditions created wealth and competition. By the 8th century BC, the settlements had begun to merge. Ditches became walls, huts clustered together, forming the nucleus of a city. Over generations, cultural influences blended. From the Greeks, the early Romans adopted religious practices and artistic styles. From the Etruscans, they learned engineering, writing, and the rituals of kingship. Even the Roman alphabet, eventually spreading across Europe, had its roots in these exchanges. The first rulers of Rome, known as the kings, governed for over 2 centuries. While their names are preserved more by legend than certainty, they reflect the city's transformation. The early kings, like Romulus and Numa Pompilius, were credited with founding temples, institutions, and festivals. Numa, especially, was said to have established Rome's religious traditions, bringing order and ceremony to a rough settlement. Under later kings, such as Tarquinius Priscus and Servius Tullius, Rome's identity evolved from a village to an emerging power. Great public works were built, the Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest sewer systems, defensive walls, and a forum, a public square that would become the heart of Roman life. The kings expanded territory through alliances and conquest, laying the groundwork for Rome's ambition. But with growth came tension. The final monarch, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, ruled with increasing arrogance. His tyranny and the outrage sparked by his son's crimes drove the people to revolt. In 509 BC, the Romans expelled the kings and declared that never again would one man hold absolute power over their city. This moment was more than political upheaval. It was a declaration of identity, that Rome would belong to its citizens, not its monarchs. The values of duty, discipline, and civic virtue took root, shaping the republic that followed. Yet, even as the Romans embraced their new freedom, the legends of their past remained vital. They were reminders of destiny and warning signs of hubris. The wolf and the twins became emblems etched in stone and bronze. Festivals like the Lupercalia kept ancient rituals alive, blending myth and memory into everyday life. When we look back on these origins, we see more than a founding story. We see how a small community, bound by shared beliefs and necessity, claimed its place in history. We see how myths can unite a people, giving them a sense of purpose and exceptionalism. And we see how the seeds of greatness and of conflict are often planted side by side. The early republic. When Rome expelled its last king in 509 BC, it stepped into a bold experiment, a state without monarchy, governed by its citizens. This system, the Roman Republic, would endure for nearly 5 centuries. Its strengths and contradictions would shape Rome's destiny and leave an imprint that still resonates today. At its core, the Republic was built on a delicate balance of power. No single person could claim absolute authority. Instead, Rome divided its government into institutions designed to check and restrain each other. The Senate, a council of elders drawn mainly from the patrician class, Rome's old aristocratic families, held immense prestige. It advised magistrates, managed finances, and guided foreign policy. Beside the Senate stood the assemblies, gatherings where citizens voted on laws, elected officials, and decided matters of war and peace. While the assemblies gave ordinary Romans a voice, the influence of wealth and patronage meant that not all votes carried equal weight. Even so, compared to many societies of the ancient world, this was an extraordinary form of civic participation. The highest offices in the Republic were the consuls, 2 elected magistrates who shared power equally. Each consul held imperium, the authority to command armies and administer justice. To prevent tyranny, their term lasted only 1 year. At the end of their term, consuls could be called to account for their actions. If Rome faced grave danger, the Senate could appoint a dictator, a single ruler with absolute power, but only for 6 months. These safeguards reflected Rome's fear of monarchy and its determination never to be ruled by kings again. Yet beneath this framework, Rome's society was marked by sharp divisions. Patricians controlled most wealth and political influence. The plebeians, Rome's common citizens, were farmers, artisans, and laborers. They served in the army and paid taxes, but they had limited access to the offices of state. Resentment grew, culminating in a series of struggles known as the Conflict of the Orders. In 494 BC, plebeians took the unprecedented step of withdrawing from the city and refusing to serve in the army, a mass protest that stunned the patrician leadership. Rome faced the risk of collapse without its citizen soldiers. In response, compromises were made. The office of the tribune of the plebs was created, officials who could veto legislation harmful to the plebeian class and protect their rights. Over time, plebeians gained more concessions: access to the consulship, the right to intermarry with patricians, and the codification of laws. This codification came in the form of the 12 tables, engraved on bronze plaques and displayed in the forum. For the first time, Roman law was written and made public, reducing the power of patricians to manipulate legal customs to their advantage. The 12 tables covered everything from property disputes to family rights and penalties for theft. Though harsh by modern standards, they were a foundation for equality under the law. The Republic's early centuries were also marked by continuous warfare. Rome's neighbors, the Etruscans, the Volsci, the Equi, viewed the young Republic as a rival and a threat. Every year, consuls led armies beyond the city walls to defend and expand Roman territory. These campaigns forged a martial spirit that became central to Roman identity. Service in the legions was both a duty and an honor. As Rome's influence grew, so did the need for alliances. The Latin League, a coalition of Latin-speaking communities, alternated between cooperation and rebellion. In 493 BC, Rome forged a treaty recognizing mutual defense and shared spoils of war. Yet, tensions simmered. The Battle of Lake Regillus, a clash with Latin forces seeking to restore the exiled Tarquins, ended with Roman victory and further cemented their ascendancy. By the 4th century BC, Rome was no longer a regional player. It was becoming a dominant force in central Italy. It fought the Samnites in a series of brutal conflicts known as the Samnite Wars. These wars taught Rome hard lessons in strategy, fortification, and adaptability. After early defeats, Roman commanders learned to innovate, creating new formations and tactics that would become hallmarks of Roman military success. At home, the Republic refined its institutions. Censors were appointed to conduct the census, oversee public morality, and manage state contracts. Praetors were created to handle legal matters, while quaestors managed finances. Every office had a defined term, and no man could hold too much power for too long. This system of checks and balances, mixed government, fascinated later thinkers like Polybius, who saw in Rome a model combining monarchy, the consuls, aristocracy, the Senate, and democracy, the assemblies. Yet beneath these safeguards lay ambition, the desire of great men to carve their names into history. Over time, as Rome's territories grew and its wealth multiplied, that ambition would become both the Republic's strength and its fatal flaw. Still, in these early centuries, the Romans forged their identity, a people who valued discipline, sacrifice, and the belief that service to the Republic was the highest calling. The phrase SPQR, Senatus Populosque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome, was more than an inscription on standards and monuments. It was a declaration of unity. From these humble beginnings, Rome would build an empire. But before conquest came consolidation, the long-determined effort to create institutions strong enough to survive victory and defeat alike. As you imagine these formative years, picture the forum filled with citizens debating laws, legions assembling on the field of Mars, and magistrates carving new policies that would echo across the centuries. It was here, in the crucible of the early Republic, that Rome's destiny took shape. Wars of expansion. As the Republic solidified its institutions, Rome's ambitions turned outward. It was a natural progression for a city-state driven by competition and bound by a culture that prized military glory. Over the next centuries, Rome's expansion across Italy and into the Mediterranean would transform it from a regional power into an empire, reshaping the ancient world. Rome's early conquests were driven by necessity as much as by desire. The Italian peninsula was a patchwork of cultures: Etruscans in the north, Samnites in the central highlands, Greek colonies in the south. Each group had its own alliances, rivalries, and claims. As Rome grew, it inevitably collided with these neighbors. One of the first major conflicts was the struggle against the Samnites. The Samnite Wars, fought intermittently between 343 and 290 BC, were grueling campaigns that tested Rome's resilience. The Samnites were formidable mountain warriors, skilled in ambush and guerrilla tactics. Early Roman victories bred overconfidence, and in 321 BC, the Romans suffered one of their most humiliating defeats at the Caudine Forks. Trapped in a narrow mountain pass, the entire Roman army was forced to surrender. The Samnites made them pass under a yoke of spears, a ritual humiliation etched into Rome's collective memory. But Rome did not forget or forgive. Determined to recover their honor, Roman commanders restructured their legions, adapting tactics to meet the Samnites on their own terrain. Over time, Rome's discipline and ability to absorb losses wore down Samnite resistance. By the end of the Third Samnite War, Rome emerged as the unchallenged master of central Italy. With the defeat of the Samnites, Rome set its sights on the Greek colonies in the south, a region known as Magna Graecia. Among these cities, Tarentum was the most powerful and proud. When Roman ships entered its harbor in 282 BC, Tarentine forces attacked them, triggering a new conflict. Tarentum called for aid from Pyrrhus, the ambitious king of Epirus, and a kinsman of Alexander the Great. Pyrrhus arrived in Italy with a formidable army, including 20 war elephants, beasts the Romans had never encountered in battle. In 280 BC, at the Battle of Heraclea, Pyrrhus defeated the Roman legions, but at tremendous cost. When his advisors congratulated him, he is said to have replied, "Another such victory, and I am undone." This phrase gave us the term Pyrrhic victory, a success so costly it feels like defeat. Pyrrhus fought the Romans again at Asculum, winning yet another costly battle. But Rome's capacity to raise new armies again and again wore him down. After a final inconclusive campaign in Sicily, Pyrrhus withdrew and Tarentum eventually fell. Rome now controlled southern Italy. By the early 3rd century BC, Rome's power extended from the Po River in the north to the toe of the Italian peninsula. But beyond Italy lay even greater challenges. Across the Mediterranean, in North Africa, rose the city-state of Carthage, wealthy, powerful, and determined to protect its trading empire. The collision between Rome and Carthage would become legendary. The First Punic War began in 264 BC over the island of Sicily, where both powers sought influence. For over 2 decades, the conflict raged on land and at sea. Rome, lacking a naval tradition, built a fleet from scratch, learning shipbuilding by copying captured Carthaginian vessels. They invented the corvus, a boarding device that turned sea battles into infantry engagements, exploiting their strength in hand-to-hand combat. After many reverses, Rome ultimately prevailed, seizing control of Sicily and marking its first step beyond the Italian mainland. This victory came at enormous cost in lives and treasure, but it taught Rome 2 lessons: that it could defeat established powers, and that the Mediterranean was now open to further ambitions. No sooner had the First Punic War ended than Rome faced a far greater test, the Second Punic War, a conflict defined by one of history's most brilliant commanders, Hannibal Barca. In 218 BC, Hannibal led his army from Spain across the Pyrenees and the Alps into Italy. His crossing of the Alps, with elephants and thousands of soldiers, was a feat of determination that shocked Rome. For over a decade, Hannibal ravaged Italy, defeating Roman legions at Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and most devastatingly, at Cannae. At Cannae, in 216 BC, Hannibal encircled and annihilated a Roman army twice the size of his own. Over 50,000 Romans died in a single day. Panic swept Rome. But the Republic refused to surrender. Under the leadership of Fabius Maximus, known as the Delayer, Rome adopted a strategy of attrition, avoiding pitched battles and harassing Hannibal's supply lines. In time, this approach weakened the Carthaginian army. Meanwhile, Rome struck at Hannibal's base in Spain and ultimately carried the war into Africa. In 202 BC, at the Battle of Zama, Roman general Scipio Africanus faced Hannibal. The two greatest minds of their generation met on the battlefield. This time, Rome prevailed. The Third Punic War, fought decades later, was more an act of vengeance than necessity. In 146 BC, Roman legions besieged Carthage, destroyed the city, and symbolically poured salt into its soil so that nothing would grow again. Carthage ceased to exist as an independent power. These Punic Wars transformed Rome. The Republic acquired vast new provinces: Sicily, Spain, North Africa. Enormous wealth poured into Rome: tribute, slaves, and resources. But this success came at a price. Small farmers, away fighting long campaigns, often lost their lands to wealthy elites. Social tensions deepened, laying the groundwork for future conflict. Yet in these centuries of war, Rome forged an identity it never abandoned, a people convinced of their destiny to conquer and to rule. Military service became not only a duty, but a path to honor, riches, and political power. Victory in foreign wars became the surest way to gain prestige and influence at home. As you reflect on these decades of expansion, consider the paradox. The same conquests that made Rome mighty also planted the seeds of inequality and ambition that would later tear the Republic apart. The transformation of Roman society. Victory on the battlefield brought Rome enormous wealth and prestige. But beneath the triumphs, profound changes were reshaping Roman society. Changes that would test the Republic's institutions and redefine what it meant to be Roman. The first transformation was economic. As Rome conquered new provinces, rivers of gold and silver flowed into the city. Tribute from defeated enemies filled the treasury, and captured slaves poured into Italy in unprecedented numbers. A Roman commander returning from a successful campaign often celebrated a triumph, a lavish parade through the streets, displaying plunder, prisoners, and symbols of conquest. These spectacles fueled pride and ambition, reminding the people that expansion brought prosperity. Yet this prosperity was uneven. The old ideal of the small citizen farmer, tending his fields and serving in the legions, began to erode. During long campaigns abroad, countless farmers fell into debt. Unable to recover, they sold their land to wealthy patricians and equestrians, Rome's rising class of business entrepreneurs. These elites assembled vast estates known as latifundia, worked by gangs of enslaved laborers. This shift transformed the Italian countryside. Where once a patchwork of family farms had flourished, now great estates produced olive oil, wine, and grain for export. Rural communities shrank as dispossessed farmers drifted into Rome in search of work. There, they joined the swelling urban poor, a mass of citizens increasingly reliant on public handouts to survive. As the gap between rich and poor widened, resentment simmered. The optimates, the conservative senatorial elite, sought to preserve their privileges. The populares, politicians appealing to the common people, argued for reforms. This tension would soon become a fault line in Roman politics. The transformation was also cultural. Rome had long prided itself on simplicity and discipline, the stern virtues of the Republic. But contact with Greek cities and Hellenistic kingdoms exposed Romans to new ideas, art, and luxury. Greek philosophers and teachers were invited to tutor the sons of noble families. Sculptures, literature, and styles of dress from the East became fashionable. Not everyone welcomed these influences. Some senators feared that foreign customs were corrupting traditional Roman values. Cato the Elder, a respected statesman, famously declared that Greek culture would destroy the moral fiber of Rome. He criticized the spread of indulgence and the erosion of the old virtues, frugality, self-restraint, devotion to the Republic. Even religion was evolving. As Rome absorbed new territories, it also adopted foreign deities. Temples rose to honor gods and goddesses from Asia Minor, Egypt, and beyond. While the official Roman pantheon remained, the everyday spiritual landscape became more diverse, reflecting a society in flux. Political life mirrored these changes. The Senate, once a relatively stable body of patrician elders, became the arena of fierce rivalries. Ambitious generals who had gained wealth and fame in distant provinces used their resources to buy influence, reward followers, and intimidate rivals. Elections grew more expensive and bribery became common. At the same time, the needs of empire demanded new forms of governance. Managing Sicily, Spain, and Africa required provincial governors with wide-ranging powers. While many served honorably, others used their positions to extort wealth, fueling scandal and disillusionment. One of the most striking symbols of Rome's transformation was the rise of the equites, the knights. Originally a cavalry class, they evolved into a business elite. Unlike senators who were barred from direct commerce, the equites profited from tax collection, trade, and contracts. Their influence grew as the state outsourced critical functions to private companies. This blending of public service and private profit blurred lines that once separated civic duty from personal gain. Meanwhile, the city of Rome itself was changing. With over 1 million inhabitants by the 1st century BC, it was the largest metropolis the world had ever known. Its streets bustled with merchants, artisans, scholars, and laborers. Monuments and temples rose, financed by generals eager to leave a mark on the city's skyline. The Forum became more than a marketplace. It was the stage where ambition played out before a restless population. To placate the urban masses, politicians introduced measures known as bread and circuses, grain distributions and lavish entertainments in the theaters and arenas. Gladiatorial games, once rare rituals, became routine spectacles. For some, these shows were a welcome distraction from hardship. For others, they were evidence that Rome's civic spirit was in decline. Yet amid these upheavals, the Republic still commanded loyalty. The ideals of shared governance, the pride of citizenship, and the memory of ancestors who had driven out kings and conquered nations remained potent. Even the most ambitious leaders paid lip service to the Senate and the people, recognizing that legitimacy rested on tradition. As you imagine this era, picture the contradictions. Senators debating laws under marble porticos, while legions marched east to secure new conquests. Noble families teaching their children Greek philosophy, while warning against Greek decadence. Impoverished citizens crowding the steps of the temples, waiting for free grain. Generals celebrating triumphs that would fund their political careers. This was the world Rome had become, powerful, wealthy, and increasingly unstable. The old structures strained under the weight of empire. The transformation of Roman society was no accident. It was the consequence of success. In the decades ahead, these pressures would erupt in crisis. Reformers and reactionaries would clash. Legions would become loyal not to the Republic, but to the men who commanded them. And the Republic that had defied kings would face challenges it could no longer contain. But in this moment, before the storm, Rome still believed in its destiny. It still believed that its greatness could endure forever. The rise of Julius Caesar. As the Republic grew richer and more powerful, its political institutions began to fray under the strain. Personal ambition, social tension, and the demands of empire created conditions ripe for conflict. In this turbulent world, one figure emerged who would transform Roman history forever: Gaius Julius Caesar. Born in 100 BC into the patrician Julian family, Caesar's early life was shaped by both privilege and risk. His family claimed descent from Venus through Aeneas, the legendary Trojan hero, but their political influence had waned. Caesar's uncle by marriage was Gaius Marius, a brilliant general and champion of the Populares faction, politicians who sought reforms to help Rome's common citizens. When Marius fell from power and his enemies took control, Caesar was forced into hiding. His refusal to divorce his wife Cornelia, the daughter of a Marian ally, nearly cost him his life. Only through negotiation and careful alliances did he survive this dangerous period. From these early challenges, Caesar learned a lesson that would define his career. Survival depended on forging relationships and seizing opportunity. As a young man, he began to build his reputation. He served with distinction in Asia Minor, earning the prestigious civic crown for bravery. Later, as an orator and lawyer, he developed a talent for persuasive speech, a skill that would become one of his greatest weapons. Ambition burned brightly in Caesar. Returning to Rome, he worked tirelessly to win public favor. He staged lavish games and sponsored public works, spending enormous sums of borrowed money to secure loyalty. Critics accused him of reckless extravagance, but Caesar understood that in a republic where voters were easily swayed by spectacle, generosity was a currency as valuable as gold. His rise accelerated when he was elected Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, a position of enormous prestige. Soon after, he secured the praetorship and was appointed governor of Hispania Ulteria. There, he demonstrated both administrative skill and military daring, defeating local tribes and enriching his soldiers and himself. Returning to Rome, he celebrated a triumph, the ceremonial parade granted to victorious commanders. But Caesar faced a dilemma. To enjoy the triumph, he would have to remain outside the city until the ceremony. To stand for the consulship, Rome's highest office, he needed to enter the city as a private citizen. He chose politics over personal glory, foregoing the triumph to pursue his greater ambition. In 60 BC, Caesar forged an alliance that would redefine Roman politics. He joined forces with Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. This informal pact, known as the First Triumvirate, allowed each man to pursue his goals. Pompey sought land for his veterans. Crassus desired political influence and economic advantages. Caesar wanted the consulship and a military command that could propel him to greatness. Elected consul in 59 BC, Caesar skillfully advanced the triumvirate's agenda. He pushed through laws distributing land to the poor and ratifying Pompey's eastern settlements. His methods were often forceful, provoking fierce opposition from the conservative senators, the optimates. But Caesar proved adept at navigating Rome's complex politics. At the end of his consulship, he secured a 5-year command over Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum, an unprecedented opportunity. As proconsul, he commanded several legions and had wide-ranging authority. This appointment would change his life and Rome's destiny. In Gaul, Caesar embarked on a series of campaigns that would become legendary. From 58 to 50 BC, he conquered vast territories stretching from the Alps to the English Channel. He defeated powerful tribes like the Helvetii, the Nervii, and most famously, the Arverni under the charismatic leader Vercingetorix. The siege of Alesia in 52 BC was a masterpiece of military engineering and strategy. When it ended, Gaul was effectively under Roman control. These campaigns brought Caesar immense wealth and the unwavering loyalty of his soldiers. His commentaries on the Gallic War, concise, vivid reports he wrote himself, bolstered his reputation in Rome. They presented him as both a conqueror and a protector of Roman interests. Yet they also alarmed the Senate. A commander with such popularity and resources was a threat to the Republic's fragile balance. Back in Rome, Pompey began to drift away from Caesar. The death of Crassus in 53 BC during an ill-fated campaign against the Parthians removed the final link holding the triumvirate together. Tensions rose as Pompey allied himself with the Optimates, who feared Caesar's power. In 49 BC, the Senate, under Pompey's influence, demanded that Caesar disband his armies and return to Rome as a private citizen. Refusal meant being declared an enemy of the state. Facing a choice between surrender and defiance, Caesar made his decision. On a cold January night, he led the 13th Legion across the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province and Italy proper. By crossing that shallow stream, he violated Roman law. The Age of Augustus and the Pax Romana. Civil war had torn Rome apart. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he set in motion a sequence of events no one could fully control. Over the next few years, alliances shifted, armies clashed, and political norms collapsed. Though Caesar emerged victorious, he ruled as dictator for life, provoking fear that monarchy had returned. In 44 BC, he was assassinated by senators who believed they were saving the Republic. Instead, they unleashed further chaos. In the power vacuum that followed, two men rose to prominence: Mark Antony, Caesar's trusted lieutenant, and Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, better known to history as Octavian. Barely 19, Octavian was underestimated by many, but behind his youth lay extraordinary determination and political instinct. At first, Octavian and Antony formed a fragile alliance with Lepidus, creating the Second Triumvirate. Together, they pursued the assassins of Caesar. The decisive battles came at Philippi in 42 BC, where Brutus and Cassius, leaders of the conspirators, were defeated. The Republic, in any true sense, was dead. With their enemies vanquished, the triumvirs turned on one another. Lepidus was pushed aside. Tensions between Octavian and Antony escalated into open conflict, fueled by personal rivalries and propaganda. Antony's alliance and romantic relationship with Queen Cleopatra of Egypt gave Octavian the pretext he needed to accuse him of betraying Rome. In 31 BC, at the naval battle of Actium, Octavian's forces defeated Antony and Cleopatra. The lovers retreated to Alexandria, where they ultimately took their own lives. With their deaths, Octavian became the undisputed master of the Roman world. Yet, Octavian understood that Rome could not simply return to monarchy without resistance. He embarked on a careful strategy to consolidate power while preserving the outward forms of republican government. In 27 BC, he offered to surrender his extraordinary powers back to the Senate. The gesture was theatrical and brilliantly calculated. The Senate, grateful for stability, begged him to remain in control. They awarded him a new title, Augustus, meaning the revered one. So began the Principate, a system in which Augustus held ultimate authority, though he styled himself as princeps, or first citizen, rather than king. He retained control over the legions, provincial appointments, and the treasury. The Senate continued to meet, but real power rested in the hands of the emperor. Augustus understood that legitimacy required more than force. He promoted a vision of moral renewal, positioning himself as the restorer of Roman virtue. Laws encouraged marriage and family life. Temples and public buildings were constructed to signal piety and prosperity. The poet Virgil composed the Aeneid, an epic linking Rome's origins to the heroic age of Troy, casting Augustus as the fulfillment of destiny. His reign inaugurated a period known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which would endure for more than 2 centuries. This era was marked by relative stability, economic growth, and cultural flourishing. Under Augustus, the empire's frontiers were secured. In the north, legions pushed into the Alps and the Danube Valley. In the west, Spain was pacified. To the east, client kingdoms like Judea acknowledged Roman supremacy. Augustus preferred indirect rule where possible, using diplomacy and alliances to maintain control. One of his most enduring achievements was the professionalization of the Roman army. Soldiers now served 20-year terms, receiving regular pay, training, and the promise of land or a pension upon discharge. This created a standing military, loyal to the emperor, a powerful asset, and, in time, a potential threat to imperial stability. The capital itself was transformed. Augustus famously boasted, "I found Rome a city of bricks, and left it a city of marble." He sponsored roads, aqueducts, theaters, and forums, reshaping the urban landscape. The Arapakis, the altar of peace, commemorated his victories and the stability he brought. Yet the Pax Romana was not merely an age of monuments. Trade flourished across the Mediterranean. Grain flowed from Egypt. Silk arrived from China via caravan routes, and luxury goods from Africa, Gaul, and the East filled Roman markets. Cities across the provinces adopted Roman architecture, language. Crisis of the 3rd century. The Pax Romana, the long season of Roman peace, could not last forever. Beneath the surface of prosperity lay tensions that would eventually erupt into crisis. The 3rd century AD became one of the most turbulent eras in Rome's history, a time of plague, invasion, economic collapse, and political chaos. For nearly 50 years, the empire teetered on the brink of disintegration. The trouble began with succession. After the Julio-Claudian dynasty fell, Rome endured decades of emperors rising and falling, some ruling wisely, others violently. While capable rulers like Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius held the empire together, their successors struggled to maintain stability. By the late 2nd century, Marcus Aurelius' son, Commodus, had squandered resources and undermined confidence in imperial leadership. His assassination in 192 AD plunged Rome into civil war. This period, known as the Year of the Five Emperors, witnessed rapid shifts of power. Generals competed for the throne, backed by legions loyal not to the state but to their commanders. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguard, auctioned the imperial office to the highest bidder. The Senate, once the proud heart of Roman governance, had become largely ceremonial. When Septimius Severus eventually seized power, he brought momentary stability. But his reign set troubling precedents. He increased soldiers' pay, cementing their loyalty, and allowed the military to play an ever greater role in politics. His successors, notably Caracalla, expanded citizenship across the empire, granting legal rights but also broadening the tax base to fund growing expenses. These policies could not resolve deeper structural problems. The Roman economy depended on continuous conquest to fuel growth, but by the 3rd century, expansion had slowed. Trade networks became more vulnerable to disruption, and the empire's borders grew harder to defend. Inflation soared as emperors debased the currency, mixing more base metals into silver coins to pay troops and bribe officials. Confidence in money eroded. In many regions, people returned to barter. While economic troubles mounted, new threats gathered along the frontiers. In the east, the Sassanid Persians replaced the Parthians as Rome's main rival. Under Shapur I, they captured Roman territories and humiliated emperors in battle. In 260 AD, Emperor Valerian marched east to repel the Persians. He was captured, the only Roman emperor ever taken alive by an enemy, and died in captivity, a catastrophic blow to Roman prestige. In the west, Germanic tribes pressed harder across the Rhine and Danube. The Alemanni raided deep into Gaul and northern Italy. The Goths launched invasions into the Balkans and even sacked cities in Asia Minor. For Roman citizens accustomed to centuries of security, these attacks shattered the illusion of invincibility. As if invasions were not enough, the empire faced internal fragmentation. Regional commanders, alarmed by weak central authority, broke away to form splinter states. In Gaul, a separatist Gallic empire emerged under Postumus. In the east, the city of Palmyra, under Queen Zenobia, carved out an independent kingdom, controlling vital trade routes. While some historians admire Zenobia's ambition and cultural achievements, to Rome, her rebellion was yet another sign that the empire was unraveling. Disease added to the misery. The plague of Cyprian, possibly a smallpox or measles epidemic, swept through the empire between 249 and 262 AD. Contemporary accounts describe bodies piled in the streets, cities depopulated, and armies weakened by illness. Some estimates suggest the disease killed millions. The combination of plague, invasion, and economic crisis created a sense of profound insecurity. In art and literature, the confident realism of earlier centuries gave way to more anxious, abstract styles. Statues of emperors grew severe and rigid, reflecting an era in which power was more fragile than ever. Yet even in this darkness, Rome showed its resilience. A succession of short-lived emperors rose and fell, more than 20 rulers in 50 years. Some were little more than puppets, installed by mutinous legions. Others were ambitious generals seeking to restore order. Each time a crisis peaked, a new strongman emerged to push back the chaos, if only for a while. This period saw the elevation of many soldier emperors, men who came not from the senatorial elite, but from the provinces and the army. They understood the empire's needs better than any detached aristocrat. Leaders like Claudius, Gothicus, and Aurelian were products of this environment, hard, pragmatic, ruthless when necessary. Claudius earned fame by defeating the Goths in battle, briefly restoring confidence. Aurelian, who reigned from 270 to 275, went further. Known as restorer of the world, he reconquered the Gallic and Palmyrene breakaway states and strengthened the empire's frontiers. He began construction of the massive Aurelian walls around Rome, a visible admission that the Eternal City itself was no longer safe from attack. Still, no single victory could fully resolve the underlying problems. The crisis of the 3rd century exposed the vulnerabilities of Rome's overextended system, a vast territory reliant on fragile trade, governed by institutions designed for a city-state, not a world empire. When you picture this era, imagine a world on the edge, cities under siege, legions marching across fractured provinces, emperors rising and falling in rapid succession. The old certainties were gone. Rome was learning that no empire, however mighty, is immune to decline. Yet in the face of catastrophe, Rome did not collapse. A new generation of emperors would soon rise to reimagine the empire, proving that the story of Rome was far from over. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine. By the end of the 3rd century AD, the Roman Empire had survived the worst crisis in its long history. 50 years of chaos had left cities ruined, trade routes broken, and loyalty to Rome in tatters. Yet even in this darkness, new leaders arose who refused to accept decline as destiny. 2 emperors in particular, Diocletian and Constantine, would reshape the empire and set it on a new course. Diocletian emerged from humble origins in the Balkans. A seasoned soldier, he was proclaimed emperor by his troops in 284 AD. From the start, Diocletian understood that no single ruler could manage an empire as vast and diverse as Rome. He believed that division of responsibility was the only path to stability. In 293 AD, he established the Tetrarchy, a system of government in which power was shared among 4 emperors. Diocletian ruled as Senior Augustus in the east, with Maximian as co-Augustus in the west. Each Augustus appointed a junior Caesar to help govern and eventually succeed them. This arrangement was designed to provide smoother transitions of power and more responsive leadership across the provinces. The Tetrarchy also sent a message. Rome was no longer the realm of one man's ambition. It was an institution greater than any individual that demanded discipline and unity. The emperors adopted a new style of rule, more formal, more remote. They wore jeweled crowns and elaborate robes, surrounded themselves with ceremony, and demanded that subjects kneel in their presence. These changes signaled the transformation of Roman leadership from a civic role to a near-sacred office. Diocletian's reforms extended beyond politics. Recognizing the empire's economic disarray, he attempted to stabilize currency and curb runaway inflation. He issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, fixing wages and the cost of goods. While ambitious, this measure proved nearly impossible to enforce and often worsened shortages. At the same time, Diocletian reorganized taxation and the administration of provinces. He increased the number of provinces to reduce the power of governors and created new dioceses overseen by trusted officials. The army, too, was restructured, with more mobile units able to respond quickly to frontier threats. Fortifications were repaired or expanded along the Rhine and Danube. But Diocletian's reign is perhaps most notorious for his fierce persecution of Christians. Determined to restore what he saw as traditional Roman religion, he ordered churches destroyed, scriptures burned, and believers imprisoned or executed. These persecutions were the harshest the Christian communities had ever faced. Yet they failed to extinguish the new faith. Instead, they strengthened the Christian sense of identity and martyrdom. In 305 AD, after 20 years in power, Diocletian did something no emperor had ever done. He voluntarily abdicated. Weakened by illness, he retired to his palace at Split in modern Croatia, a vast fortified residence that still stands today as Diocletian's palace. His departure, however, did not end the turmoil. Rivalry soon erupted among the tetrarchs and their supporters. Civil war flared again as ambitious generals vied for supreme power. From this struggle, one man would emerge as the new master of Rome, Constantine. Constantine, the son of Constantius, one of the original Caesars, was proclaimed emperor by his troops in 306 AD. Over the next 2 decades, he fought a series of wars against rivals, including Maxentius in the west and Licinius in the east. His most famous victory came in 312 AD at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge outside Rome. According to legend, on the eve of the battle, Constantine had a vision of a cross of light in the sky, bearing the words, "In hoc signo vinces," "In this sign you will conquer." The next day, he ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol, the Chi-Rho, on their shields. After defeating Maxentius, Constantine entered Rome as the undisputed ruler of the Western Empire. This moment marked a profound turning point in Roman and world history. Constantine became the first emperor to embrace Christianity, granting it legal status through the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. Though he continued to honor traditional Roman gods publicly, his support for Christianity reshaped Roman society. Churches were built across the empire, bishops gained influence, and Christian communities emerged from hiding to become powerful social institutions. Constantine also reformed the imperial bureaucracy. He continued Diocletian's policies of centralization and introduced new gold coins, the solidus, that would become the stable currency of the late empire. He reorganized the military, creating more mobile field armies to counter threats along the frontiers. Yet Constantine's most enduring legacy was the founding of a new imperial capital. Recognizing that Rome had become politically and strategically obsolete, he selected the ancient Greek city of Byzantium as his base. In 330 AD, it was rededicated as Constantinople, Nova Roma, the New Rome. Its location on the Bosporus Strait allowed the emperor to control key trade routes and defend against Eastern invasions. Constantinople would become the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire for over 1,000 years, long after the Western provinces fell to barbarian kingdoms. Its walls, palaces, and churches stood as symbols of Roman continuity and Christian triumph. In his final years, Constantine consolidated his dynasty by naming his sons as successors. He was baptized on his deathbed in 337 AD. The reforms of Diocletian and Constantine reshaped every aspect of Roman life: political, military, economic, and religious. Their policies preserved the empire for another century in the West and much longer in the East. But their centralization of power and dependence on imperial authority also left the system vulnerable to weak or corrupt rulers. When you reflect on this era, imagine a world in transition. Emperors draped in golden robes, Christian bishops debating doctrine, soldiers drilling along fortified borders, and merchants carrying goods from Britain to Syria. It was a time when Rome struggled to reinvent itself to meet new challenges. Though the old republic was long dead, the empire endured, transformed, adapted, and reborn under leaders who refused to surrender to decline. The fall of the Western Roman Empire. By the late 4th century AD, Rome still called itself the Eternal City, but the empire it had built was cracking under the weight of centuries. Though Constantine and his successors had postponed collapse with reforms and new capitals, they could not reverse the deeper currents of decline. The challenges were many and intertwined. Economically, the Western Empire had grown weaker. Agricultural production fell as farmland was exhausted and abandoned. Trade routes across the Mediterranean faced disruption from pirates and declining infrastructure. Coinage became increasingly debased. As revenues shrank, the government levied ever higher taxes, burdening small landholders and driving many into debt or dependency on great estates. Socially, the old civic identity of Roman citizenship had frayed. More people now looked for protection and purpose not from the imperial state, but from powerful local landlords or bishops. Cities that had once bustled with commerce and public life shrank as populations fled to the countryside to escape taxation and insecurity. Meanwhile, the empire faced growing threats along its frontiers. For centuries, Roman legions had held the Rhine and Danube rivers as formidable barriers against the Germanic tribes beyond. But the world beyond the lines was changing. New confederations of peoples, the Goths, Vandals, Franks, and later the Huns, pressed westward in search of better land, security, or plunder. In 376 AD, one of the great migrations began. The Visigoths, fleeing the ferocious advance of the Huns across the steppes, sought refuge within Roman territory. At first, Emperor Valens permitted them to settle in the Balkans, but corrupt officials exploited them, demanding bribes and starving them of supplies. Resentment erupted into open revolt. 2 years later, in 378 AD, Roman forces confronted the Visigoths near the city of Adrianople. The result was disaster. Valens was killed, and 2/3 of his army perished. It was one of the worst defeats Rome had suffered in centuries, and a stark warning that the legions were no longer invincible. The empire never fully recovered its control over the Balkans. In the early 5th century, new waves of invaders crossed into Roman lands. The Vandals and Alans swept through Gaul into Spain. The Suebi carved out their own kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula. Britain, long a Roman province, was abandoned to local rule and Saxon incursions. Yet the event that shocked the Roman world most came in 410 AD. Under their king Alaric, the Visigoths marched on Italy and laid siege to Rome itself. For 3 days, the city was sacked. Though not completely destroyed, the psychological impact was immense. Rome had not fallen to an enemy in 800 years. St. Jerome wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." Even after Alaric's death, the Western Empire struggled to rebuild. In North Africa, the Vandals seized Carthage, a vital source of grain and tax revenue. Without Africa's wealth, Rome's finances crumbled further. At the same time, the Western emperors became increasingly weak. Many were little more than puppets of powerful generals or Germanic warlords who held the real authority. The Eastern Empire and Constantinople sometimes sent aid, but more often regarded the West as a burden it could no longer save.
Yet Rome's legacy was not lost. The Christian Church preserved Latin learning and law. Roman engineering survived in roads and bridges still in use. The dream of empire would inspire Charlemagne, the Holy Roman emperors, and countless rulers who claimed to be heirs of Roman glory. As you reflect on this ending, imagine the contrast. The eternal city, once center of a world-spanning empire, now ruled by foreign kings. Yet in this twilight, the seeds of a new civilization were planted, one that would one day call itself Christendom, and look back to Rome as both a warning and an ideal. Though the Western Empire fell, the idea of Rome endured. In law, language, architecture, and faith, Rome lived on, an echo across centuries, reminding all who came after of its rise, its splendor, and its inevitable decline.